A 14-inch silicon carbide crystal takes roughly a week to grow, 1 centimeter per day, inside a furnace running hotter than the surface of the sun. From a powder so pure, a single stray atom can ruin the entire boule. Wolfspeed, the American company that built the dominant position in this market, is still wrestling with yield and ramp challenges at 6-inch diameter. Chinese labs are claiming to ship 8-inch at volume and demonstrate 14-inch crystals. That is not the story. The story is what happened after they won. The trophy turned out to be the opening bell of a price war eating the winners alive. 3 layers: the record, the collapse, and the gap that nobody put in the headline. Silicon carbide is the substrate of choice for high voltage, high temperature power chips, the kind inside electric vehicle drivetrains, grid inverters, and industrial motor drives. The physics are unforgiving. The crystal forms at roughly 2000 degrees Celsius. Defects propagate invisibly through the boule until you slice it open and test each wafer. Growing silicon carbide at scale is categorically harder than growing silicon, not incrementally harder, categorically. A 14-inch silicon carbide wafer is roughly the diameter of a large pizza. Silicon fabs have been cutting chips from 12-inch silicon wafers for 2 decades. Western silicon carbide producers only recently reached 6-inch at volume. The jump to 14-inch, if it holds at commercial yield, compresses roughly a decade of Western roadmap into a laboratory demonstration. Growing a boule at that diameter is like pulling a single crystal icicle 6 inches wide without one internal crack, inside a furnace, under inert gas, for a week straight. One vibration, one impurity, and the whole thing becomes gravel. The diameter record is real, or close enough that nobody's disputing the underlying physics. What the press releases did not include is what became of the companies that got there. Multiple Chinese silicon carbide producers received significant state and provincial support over roughly the same window. Reports from Chinese financial press and industry analysts document the incentive structures, though exact figures vary by source. When dozens of producers target the same government-defined technical milestone simultaneously, reaching the milestone does not confer exclusivity. It confers parity. China did not just catch up on silicon carbide, it overshot into a coordination failure. When state incentives push dozens of producers toward the same technical finish line at once, the finish line gets crossed and then immediately becomes worthless as a competitive advantage. The trophy is real. The moat it was supposed to dig never formed. Think of every bakery in a city perfecting the same sourdough recipe on the same weekend. Nobody holds an edge. The only move left is to cut the price of the loaf. That is exactly what followed. Reports from Chinese industry media and analyst commentary described sharp margin compression among domestic silicon carbide device makers through 2024 and into 2025. Trade press figures suggest price declines of 50% or more for certain device categories over roughly 2 years, though these are order of magnitude directional estimates from trade sources, not audited market data. When device prices fall faster than substrate and production costs, producers are selling below any sustainable margin. Smaller, less capitalized firms exit or get absorbed. The survivors are whoever can endure the longest, which means whoever has the lowest input costs, and that question loops directly back to where the wafers come from. Wolfspeed and European device makers have long-term supply agreements and at least partial substrate integration. Many of the Chinese firms competing on price right now do not. Selling a silicon carbide power module below cost to hold market share is like funding a restaurant by burning the furniture. The dining room looks fine until there is nowhere to sit. Here is the number that reframes everything above it. Analyst estimates suggest China's silicon carbide substrate self-sufficiency, meaning domestic supply covering domestic device demand, sits somewhere in the range of 20 to 30%. That figure varies depending on how the source defines demand and counts production, and it has not been confirmed by any official statistic or independent audit, so treat it as directionally indicative rather than precise. Silicon carbide substrates, the raw wafers before any device layers are grown, remain dominated historically by a small number of producers in the United States and Japan, a country that demonstrates 14-inch crystal growth in a laboratory but imports the bulk of its production. Substrates has demonstrated a capability ceiling, not supply chain independence. Think of the substrate as the blank canvas. China's silicon carbide industry has mastered painting, electric vehicle power modules, inverter chips, finished devices. It is still ordering most of its canvas from abroad. You can win the art prize and still depend entirely on someone else's paper mill. I find this the most quietly damning detail in the whole story. A 20 to 30% self-sufficiency figure means China's silicon carbide industry can grow the crystal under controlled conditions and cannot reliably feed its own device fabs at volume. That is not a gap at the edge of an otherwise complete system. That is a structural dependency sitting at the foundation of a supposed independence play. Scaling domestic substrate supply to close that gap requires not just crystal growth, but consistent high-yield slicing, polishing, and epitaxial layer deposition at commercial volume. Each a separate and demanding manufacturing challenge. The strongest counterarguments deserve to be taken seriously, not dismissed. First, on the 14-inch milestone itself, a demonstrated crystal and a commercial production ramp are not the same object. No independent yield data at 14 inches has been published. China's producers may be reporting a capability that exists in a laboratory, not a throughput that exists on a factory floor. The claim and the proof are not yet the same thing. Second, price wars consolidate industries. The firms that survive the current margin destruction will emerge leaner, more scaled, and substantially harder to dislodge. Western analysts reading margin compression as permanent weakness may be reading a temporary phase and calling it a structural condition. The pain is real. The Darwinian output is also real. Third, the 20 to 30% self-sufficiency estimate reflects current capacity against current demand. Chinese investment data suggests substrate capacity. Build-out is at least intended, and physical limits on crystal growth are engineering problems, not natural laws. The gap may close faster than a current snapshot implies. All three counterarguments are valid. The honest synthesis: China has demonstrated silicon carbide capability that would have seemed implausible 5 years ago, is enduring a painful but possibly temporary price war phase, and has not yet closed the substrate gap that would make the capability durable. Whether this moment is a rough patch inside a winning trajectory or a structural ceiling depends on substrate yield data that has not been made public. There is a pattern that runs through China's semiconductor story. A restriction redirects energy down an unexplored road. Export controls on advanced logic chips accelerated Chinese investment in legacy nodes, memory, and compound semiconductors. The wall became a map. Silicon carbide is the inversion of that pattern. No foreign restriction forced 30 companies to race toward the same 14-inch milestone. Chinese industrial policy, subsidies, technical targets, procurement signals created its own version of the constraint. The wall was domestic. It still became a map. The map ran to a cliff. My read is that China's silicon carbide achievement is genuine and should not be dismissed. The crystal, the volume ramp, the price pressure landing on Western producers, these are real. But the trophy on the shelf and the foundation under the floor are two different things. And right now, the foundation is still largely imported. The price war is burning the capital that would fund the substrate build-out. That is not a conspiracy or a policy failure. It is what happens when a sprint gets mistaken for a strategy. The restriction that became a map this time was self-drawn, and the road it mapped runs straight to the edge of a substrate cliff that nobody has crossed yet. The trophy is real. The question is whether the shelf it is sitting on is domestically made. Winning the hardest material race in power semiconductors turns out to be the easy part. Building the supply chain underneath the win is the race that is still running. If you are allocating capital in the silicon carbide space right now, substrate producers, device makers, or the equipment companies sitting in between, where does the price war actually create the opportunity? Tell me in the comments, and if this kind of inside the numbers breakdown is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one goes deeper into where the substrate gap actually gets closed, or does not.